The fearless alien warrior meets a human veteran. Commander Xyra stood in the dimly lit interrogation chamber, arms crossed over her armored chest. She had fought in countless battles across the galaxy. She had crushed empires, burned planets, and silenced entire species. Yet, standing before her now was a single human, a captured soldier, sitting calmly in his chair as if he had nothing to fear. Xyra studied him closely. His name was Captain Daniel Reeves, a veteran of Earth's wars. Unlike the soldiers she had fought before, he showed no fear, no trembling hands, no begging for mercy. His eyes, sharp and steady, held something she could not understand. Her second in command, a towering reptilian core warrior, sneered. "Shall I break him, Commander?" Xyra lifted a hand, silencing him. "No," she said, stepping forward. "I will speak with the human." She sat across from Daniel, her piercing violet eyes locked onto his. "You are a soldier," she said, "yet you are weak. Your species lost the war before I could even fight you in battle. Why do you not tremble before me?" Daniel smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Tremble? You think I'm afraid?" He let out a small chuckle. "I've seen worse things than you, lady." Xyra frowned. No one had ever dared to laugh in her presence. "You think war is a joke?" Daniel shook his head. "War is hell. And if you think you know war, let me tell you something. You don't." Her eyes narrowed. "I have destroyed entire worlds." Daniel nodded. "And I've seen men fight in the mud, starving, freezing, bleeding, refusing to give up until the last breath left their bodies." He leaned forward. "You think you understand war because you've won battles. War isn't about winning. It's about surviving." Xyra scoffed. "Empty words. The core have conquered countless planets. No species has ever endured against us." Daniel chuckled again, this time shaking his head. "Then you've never faced humans in a real fight." Silence filled the room. Xyra studied him, trying to decide if he was lying or if he truly believed his words. "Tell me," she said finally, "if humans are so strong, why did you lose?" Daniel's smirk faded. He sighed, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. "We didn't lose. We stopped fighting. There's a difference." Xyra's sharp gaze locked onto his. "Explain." Daniel sat up straighter. "You want to know about war? Fine. Let me tell you about Stalingrad." Xyra had never heard of this place. "What is Stalingrad?" Daniel's voice grew lower, more serious. "A city, a battlefield, a frozen hell where men fought for months, trapped in ice, with no food, no hope. And yet, they did not surrender." Xyra leaned in slightly, despite herself. "Imagine thousands of men dying every day," Daniel continued. "They fought in the streets, in the rubble, in the sewers, starving, exhausted, outnumbered. But they never stopped fighting. They fought with broken guns. They fought with knives. Some fought with their bare hands." Xyra's fingers tightened around the armrest of her chair. The thought of such a battle made even her warrior's heart stir. "No matter what happened," Daniel went on, "they never surrendered. Because surrender meant death. And if death was coming either way, they would rather go down fighting." The room was silent. Even the other core warriors, once laughing at Daniel, now stood still, listening. Xyra finally spoke, her voice quieter than before. "Your people fought like this." Daniel nodded. "And not just in Stalingrad. We've fought wars so brutal that history barely remembers the cost. Every war we fought, we lost something. But every time, we came back stronger." Xyra studied him carefully. She had never met a warrior like this before. He was not boasting of victories. He was not seeking glory. He spoke of war as something terrible, yet something his people had endured time and time again. Slowly, she stood up. "You speak well, human, but words mean nothing without action. If your people are as strong as you say, why did they not fight us until the end?" Daniel met her gaze, unflinching. Because we knew when to stop. Zyra's lips pressed into a thin line. She turned, motioning for the guards to follow her. Before leaving, she glanced back at him one last time. You are an interesting creature, Captain Reeves, but we shall see if your words hold any truth. As she left, Daniel leaned back in his chair, a small smirk playing on his lips. He had her attention now, and that was the first step. The war that changed everything. Commander Xyra stood in her quarters, staring out at the endless void of space. The human's words lingered in her mind. She had crushed countless enemies, but none had spoken of war the way Captain Daniel Reeves had. He did not see it as a path to glory or a test of strength. He spoke of it as something brutal, something endless, something that left scars far deeper than the battlefield. Zyra clenched her fists. Could it be true? Could there be a species that understood war more than the Corps? She turned abruptly, her long cloak flowing behind her as she marched toward the interrogation chamber. She needed to know more. Daniel sat in his cell, calm as ever, when the heavy metal doors slid open. Zyra strode in, her violet eyes unreadable. You still believe your kind are masters of war? She asked, voice steady. Daniel gave a half-smile. I don't believe anything. I know it. Zyra sat across from him, folding her arms. Tell me then. Tell me about the war that changed your people forever. Daniel exhaled, his expression growing darker. You want to know what war really is? Fine. Let me tell you about the day we learned how to destroy the world. Zyra raised an eyebrow. Destroy. Daniel's voice was low, steady. The year was 1945. My people had been fighting for 6 long years in a war that stretched across the planet. Millions had died. Cities were reduced to rubble. But that wasn't enough. It was never enough. Zyra remained silent, listening. We had created something new. A weapon that could end a war in seconds. The atomic bomb. Zyra frowned. What is this bomb? Daniel's eyes locked onto hers. A single bomb. Just one. And it turned an entire city into fire and ash in an instant. For the first time, Zyra hesitated. You expect me to believe such a thing? Daniel nodded. I don't expect you to believe. I expect you to listen. The city was called Hiroshima. One moment it was filled with men, women, children, living their lives, just like any other day. And then, he snapped his fingers. Gone. Zyra felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation in her chest. Unease. Daniel continued, his voice steady but grim. The fire spread so fast, no one could run. People turned to shadows on the walls. Their bodies just vanished. And 3 days later, we did it again. Another bomb. Another city. Nagasaki. Silence. Zyra could hear the breathing of the guards behind her, could feel their unease. Even hardened warriors who had conquered entire worlds had never imagined such a thing. You think you know war, Daniel said, leaning forward. But tell me, Commander, has your empire ever wiped out an entire city with the press of a button? Have you ever built a weapon so powerful, you fear using it yourself? Zyra's jaw tightened. The war ended after that, Daniel continued. Not because we were stronger, not because we were smarter, but because we showed the world what would happen if we didn't stop. We learned that war wasn't just about who had the biggest army. It was about how far you were willing to go. Zyra remained silent, processing his words. And what did your people do after that? Did you build more of these bombs? Daniel let out a humorless laugh. Oh, we built them. Thousands of them. Zyra's eyes widened. Thousands. Daniel nodded. Enough to destroy our entire planet 100 times over. And for years, we lived knowing that at any moment, all it would take was one mistake, one bad decision, and everything would end. Zyra felt a chill run through her spine. A species that had lived on the edge of extinction, by their own hand, yet still survived. You call yourselves warriors, Daniel said, shaking his head. But warriors fight battles. We fought a war so massive, so devastating, that we were forced to stare into the abyss of our own destruction, and instead of falling, we pulled back. That's what makes us different. Zara exhaled slowly, her mind racing. The Corps had never hesitated in war. They had never known fear. But this was something else. She studied the human before her. He was not boasting. He was not seeking to intimidate her. He was simply stating the truth. You survived this war, she said carefully. And yet, your people still fight. Daniel nodded. Because war never really ends. We just find new ways to fight. Zara rose from her seat, staring at him for a long moment. She had come into this room expecting to mock him, to prove him wrong. Instead, she found herself shaken. You may not be as weak as I thought, she admitted, but I will hear more. I want to know the worst war your kind has ever fought. Daniel smirked. Then sit down, Commander. Because the next one, it makes Hiroshima look like a warm-up. Zara sat. For the first time in her life, she was not giving orders. She was listening. The battle that should have killed us. Commander Xira did not sleep that night. She sat alone in her private chamber, staring at the metal walls, replaying Daniel's words in her mind. A single bomb, a city erased, thousands of weapons, each one capable of ending everything. She had thought she understood war. She had thought she knew the cost of battle. But this was madness. Her people, the Corps, had never hesitated to crush their enemies. They had conquered planets, slaughtered resistance, and brought entire species to their knees, but they had never destroyed entire cities in an instant. They had never lived knowing that, at any moment, their own weapons could end them all. And yet, humans had survived. Zara clenched her fists. How? The question burned in her mind, and she knew there was only one place to find the answer. Tell me about the worst war your people have ever fought. Xira's voice was steady, but Daniel saw the tension in her shoulders. She was unsettled. Good. He had her attention now, and he wasn't about to waste it. Daniel leaned forward, his eyes locked onto hers. You want to hear about the worst war? Fine. Let me tell you about Stalingrad. Zara frowned. I have never heard of it. Daniel smirked. You wouldn't have. It was a war fought on Earth, between humans. No aliens, no advanced weapons, just men, bullets, and the cold. Zira's frown deepened. What made this war so terrible? Daniel's expression darkened. Because it should have killed us all. He exhaled slowly, as if forcing himself to relive something buried deep in his mind. It was winter. A brutal, freezing winter. The kind where the air cuts your skin like a blade, and the snow buries the dead before the survivors can even mourn them. Daniel's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, something raw, something heavy. It was 1942. The world was already on fire. Millions were dead. And at the heart of it all was a city called Stalingrad. A city where two armies clashed, neither willing to surrender, neither able to retreat. Zara leaned in, intrigued despite herself. And what happened? Daniel's lips curled into a grim smile. Hell happened. The frozen graveyard. The city was turned into a battlefield unlike anything you can imagine. Buildings collapsed from shelling, entire streets burned, and the dead piled up faster than the snow could cover them. But no one stopped fighting. Zara's fingers tightened against the armrest of her chair. For how long? 200 days, Daniel said. 200 days of starvation, blood, and fire. Soldiers fought in the rubble of broken homes, in the tunnels beneath the city, in frozen trenches where bodies froze solid before they could even be moved. Zara narrowed her eyes. And why did they fight so desperately? What was so important about this city? Daniel exhaled. Because losing meant death. He leaned forward. There was no escape, no reinforcements, no retreat. Both sides were trapped. And when men are trapped, When they know that surrender is not an option, they will do anything to survive. Sarah studied him carefully, even fight with their bare hands. Daniel nodded. They fought with broken rifles, with knives, with fists and teeth when there was nothing left. They fought over scraps of food. Some even ate the dead just to stay alive. The room was silent. Xera had seen brutal battles before. She had ordered exterminations, seen warriors fight to the last breath. But this was different. This was not just war. This was desperation. She forced herself to remain calm. And what happened in the end? Daniel's gaze was unreadable. In the end, the ones who could still stand won. He leaned back, his voice softer now. The city was left in ruins. The ground was soaked in blood. More than 2 million people died. Xera's eyes widened. 2 million. That was more than the population of some planets she had conquered. And yet, Daniel continued. After all that, after the starvation, the cold, the death, humanity didn't break. We rebuilt, we learned, and we kept going. Xera was silent. She had expected a story of victory, of heroism, of warriors standing triumphant over their enemies. Instead, she had been given something far more terrifying. She had been given proof of human endurance. She had been shown a war that should have destroyed them, and yet somehow had made them stronger. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter than before. Your people, they fought without hope. Daniel shook his head. No, that's where you're wrong. They fought because they had hope. Hope that they could survive, that they could outlast the enemy, that they could rebuild even after everything was lost. Xera stared at him, feeling something unfamiliar stir in her chest. She had spent her life believing that strength came from power, from dominance, from winning. But here was a man who had shown her another kind of strength, one that did not come from victory, but from the refusal to break. She stood abruptly, turning toward the door. You will tell me more. Daniel smirked. Oh, I will. And when I'm done, you'll never see war the same way again. Xera hesitated for just a moment. Then, without another word, she left. As the door shut behind her, Daniel leaned back, exhaling. He had seen that look before. The look of someone who had just realized they might be fighting the wrong war. The horror of war and the cost of victory. Commander Xera sat alone in her quarters, staring at the reflection in the polished metal of her desk. Her violet eyes, sharp and unyielding, now held something else, something she wasn't sure she liked. Doubt. She had spent her life believing in the core way. Conquest, strength, dominance. These were the things that made a species worthy. The weak were crushed, the strong rose to rule. That was how the universe worked. And yet, each time she spoke to the human, he unraveled something inside her. Captain Daniel Reeves did not boast of victories. He did not speak of war as something glorious or righteous. He spoke of war as something that left scars, something that never truly ended. Xera clenched her fists. She had to know more. She had to understand. Tell me about the warriors who survived. Daniel looked up from his seat as Xera entered the interrogation chamber. There was something different about her this time. The arrogance was still there, the strength, but there was something else too, a flicker of uncertainty. She sat down across from him, studying him with careful eyes. You have told me of war, of destruction, but what happens when the war is over? Daniel exhaled slowly, rubbing his face. You really want to know? Xera nodded. Daniel leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. All right, Commander. Let me tell you what happens after the battle is won. The war never really ends. Daniel's voice was quiet, but heavy. You see, a soldier doesn't leave the battlefield when the war is over. The battlefield follows him home. Xera frowned. What do you mean? Daniel's jaw tightened. I mean that the war never truly leaves those who fought it. You can take away their weapons. You can give them a medal, call them heroes, let them walk the streets of their homeworlds again. But inside, they're still fighting. He paused, his fingers drumming lightly against the metal table. There's a name for it. Post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD. Fedora tilted her head. A sickness. Daniel gave a bitter chuckle. Not the kind you can cure with medicine. Zaira listened as he continued. The invisible wounds. The men who fought in Stalingrad, in the trenches of World War I, in the jungles of Vietnam. They came back home, but they weren't the same. They had seen too much, done too much. Some woke up screaming in the night, reliving the battles in their dreams. Others couldn't stand the sound of fireworks or the smell of burning wood. It reminded them too much of what they had survived. Zaira frowned. But if they survived, if they won, should that not bring them peace? Daniel's gaze darkened. Winning doesn't erase the memories. It doesn't take away the ghosts. Zaira studied him carefully. And what happens to these warriors? Daniel sighed. Some find a way to live. They start families. They try to forget. Others, he hesitated. Others don't make it. Zaira's stomach tightened. They fall in battle. Daniel shook his head. No, they fall after, by their own hand. Silence. Zaira stared at him, her mind struggling to process his words. You mean, they take their own lives? She asked quietly. Daniel nodded, his face unreadable. More soldiers have died by their own hand after war than ever did on the battlefield. Zaira's breath hitched. She had never considered such a thing. Warriors who did not die in battle, but who carried wounds so deep that they could not bear to live with them. The Corps had no word for this. To them, a warrior's strength was in their body, their ability to fight. But here was something else, a pain that no blade could touch, an enemy that could not be slain. The weight of the fallen. Daniel leaned back in his chair. You asked what happens after war, Commander. This is what happens. The ones who lived carry the ones who didn't. Zaira swallowed. But why? If they fought, if they survived, why does it still haunt them? Daniel's expression was grim. Because we are not machines. We don't just move on. We remember every face, every friend we lost, every mistake we made. Zaira remained silent. She had never thought about war this way. For the Corps, battle was about honor and victory. The dead were remembered, yes, but their spirits were left behind. But humans carried their dead with them. Always. Daniel's voice was softer now. There's a saying we have. The war may be over, but the battle never leaves you. Zaira exhaled slowly. This PTSD. Do all warriors suffer from it? Daniel shook his head. Not all. Some are lucky. Some find ways to live. But for a lot of us, the past never truly lets go. Zaira clenched her jaw. She had fought for years. She had led invasions, crushed rebellions. She had ordered thousands to their deaths. And yet, when the war ended, she had always moved on. She had never thought of the warriors she left behind. Never considered the cost of the lives she had taken. For the first time in her life, she wondered, had she left ghosts behind? The price of strength. She stood abruptly, pushing back her chair. You have given me much to think about, Captain. Daniel smirked. That's what I'm here for. Zaira hesitated before speaking again. And you? Do you carry ghosts? Daniel's smirk faded. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small metal tag on a chain. Dog tags. He placed them on the table. A name was engraved on them. A name that wasn't his. I carry every one of them, he said quietly. Zaira looked at the tag, then at him. And without another word, she turned and left the room. But as she walked down the empty corridors of her warship for the first time in her life, she wondered if she was as strong as she had always believed. The war that united us. Commander Xyra had always believed war made a species strong. The core had built their empire on blood, crushing worlds, forcing submission. They believed the weak had no place in the galaxy. But after listening to Captain Daniel Reeves, she was beginning to see war in a different way. War did not just make a species strong, it also broke them. The human had spoken of battles so brutal they had scarred entire generations. He had told her of warriors who survived only to be haunted by their own memories. And yet, despite everything, humans had endured. Now she needed to know the final piece of the puzzle. Tell me, human, has war ever made your people better? Daniel raised an eyebrow at Sarah's question. It was the first time she had asked something not out of curiosity, but out of something deeper, something personal. She wasn't just trying to understand humanity anymore. She was trying to understand herself. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. You want to know if war ever made us better? He let out a long breath. All right, Commander. Let me tell you about the war that should have torn us apart, but instead brought us together. Xyra folded her arms. Go on. Daniel nodded. It started as all wars do, with hatred. The war that nearly destroyed us. It was called World War II. Daniel began. A war that stretched across the entire planet. Dozens of nations, millions of soldiers, all fighting. It was the deadliest war we had ever seen. Over 70 million people died. Xyra's eyes widened slightly. She had heard human numbers before, but the scale of destruction never ceased to surprise her. Daniel continued, his voice steady but heavy. We fought each other for power, for land, for revenge, and for 6 years the world was drowning in blood. Xyra tilted her head, and yet you survived. Daniel smirked. Not just survived. We changed. The cost of war and the birth of unity. At the end of the war, after the cities had burned and the dead had been buried, something happened that had never happened before. Xyra frowned. What? Daniel leaned in. We learned. Xyra was silent. Daniel's voice grew softer. For the first time in history, humanity looked at the destruction we had caused and said, never again. Xyra narrowed her eyes. You expect me to believe that? After so much killing, you suddenly decided to stop fighting. Daniel shook his head. Not immediately. We're still human after all. But something changed. We had seen what war could do, what it could cost us. And so, instead of preparing for the next war, we did something no one expected. Xyra listened carefully. We started working together. Daniel gestured with his hands. Nations that had spent years trying to wipe each other out suddenly sat at the same table and talked. We created something called the United Nations, a place where countries could resolve their differences with words instead of bullets. Xyra scoffed. And did it work? Daniel smirked. Not perfectly. We still fought, we still argued. But for the first time in history, we had something more than just war. We had a system, flawed, messy, and fragile, but something that gave us hope. Xyra considered this, and this United Nations, does it still exist? Daniel nodded. It does, and because of it, humans learned to work together, to find peace where there used to be war. Xyra shook her head. Peace is a lie. It never lasts. Daniel studied her. Maybe. But isn't it worth trying? Xyra was silent. The strength to choose a different path. Daniel tapped the table lightly. You asked if war ever made us better. The answer is yes, but not in the way you think. Xyra tilted her head. Daniel's voice was steady. War didn't make us strong because of the battles we won. It made us strong because we learned from our mistakes, because we saw what we could become if we didn't change. He leaned forward. Tell me, Commander, has your species ever tried to stop fighting? Xyra stiffened. The core do not stop. We conquer. That is our way. Daniel sighed. Then you'll never be more than just warriors. Zaira's hands curled into fists. And what are you, human? Daniel met her gaze. We are survivors. We are builders. We are dreamers. And we are the ones who refuse to let the past decide our future. Zaira felt something tighten in her chest, a feeling she couldn't place. Was it anger? Or was it admiration? She stood up suddenly, turning toward the door. You speak of peace, human. But I wonder, when the time comes, will your people really choose it? Or will you fall back into war, just like before? Daniel smiled. That's the thing about us, Commander. We always have a choice. Zaira hesitated. Then, without another word, she left. But as she walked through the corridors of her warship, her mind raced with thoughts she had never dared to consider. Could the Corps choose a different path? Or was war the only future they had ever known? The human warrior's greatest weapon. Commander Zaira stood on the observation deck of her warship, staring into the endless void of space. For the first time in her life, she wasn't sure what to believe. She had always thought war was strength, that the Corps' path, conquering, subjugating, expanding, was the only way a species could survive. Then she met a human. Captain Daniel Reeves had changed everything. He had shown her the horror of war, the destruction, the suffering, the cost. And yet, humans never broke. They endured. They survived. And they did something even more terrifying. They learned. Now she needed to understand something else, something far more dangerous than war itself. She turned sharply and marched toward the interrogation chamber. She had to know. Tell me, Captain, what is your greatest weapon? Daniel looked up from his seat as the heavy doors slid open. He had expected Zaira to return, but this time there was something different about her. Her steps were slower, her gaze more measured. She was thinking. Good. She sat across from him, arms crossed. You have told me of war, of suffering, but none of this explains why your people always endure, why you do not fall, even when the odds are against you. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You really want to know? Zaira nodded. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. All right, Commander. You want to know why we never break. Let me tell you about hope. Zaira frowned. Hope. Daniel smirked. Yeah. The most powerful weapon humanity has ever wielded. The fire that never dies. Daniel leaned back, stretching his arms. You see, the thing about humans is, we don't always win. In fact, we lose. A lot. We've lost wars. We've lost entire civilizations. But no matter how bad things get, we never stop fighting. Zaira tilted her head. Because of your hope. Daniel nodded. Hope is what keeps us moving forward, even when everything tells us we should give up. It's the reason a soldier fights when he knows he won't make it home. It's the reason a nation rebuilds after being burned to the ground. It's why, no matter how many times we get knocked down, we stand back up. Zaira narrowed her eyes. So you are saying hope is more powerful than war? Daniel's smirk faded. He exhaled. War is fire, Commander. It burns, it consumes, but hope. He tapped the table. Hope is the one thing fire can't destroy. Zaira frowned. She had seen warriors fight with rage, with discipline, with duty. But she had never seen warriors fight for something they believed in. She leaned forward slightly. Tell me, human, when has this hope saved you? Daniel's gaze darkened. The stand that changed everything. Ever heard of the Battle of Dunkirk? Daniel asked. Zaira shook her head. Daniel smirked. Didn't think so. It's not a battle we won. In fact, it was almost the end of us. Zaira frowned. Then why tell me this story? Daniel's voice was quiet. Because sometimes survival is more important than victory. Zaira listened as he spoke. The year was 1940. Our enemies had overrun us. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, young men, barely trained, were trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk. They had nowhere to run. The enemy was closing in. It should have been a massacre. Zyra's fingers tightened against the armrest. And was it? Daniel smiled. No. Zyra tilted her head. Why? Daniel exhaled. Because of hope. Zyra frowned. Explain. Daniel's voice grew softer. Back home, civilians, farmers, fishermen, men with nothing but tiny wooden boats, set sail across the sea, right into enemy fire. They came to save their soldiers. No one ordered them. No one forced them. They did it because they believed their people still had a chance. Zyra sat still. She had never heard of such a thing. You mean civilians, untrained, unarmed, chose to risk their lives? Daniel nodded. Thousands of them. And because of them, those soldiers made it home. The war didn't end that day. We didn't win a great victory, but we survived. And that was enough. Zyra was silent. The Corps had no word for this. No warrior would risk themselves for the weak. No army would depend on civilians. This was something else. Something she could not understand. The strength to keep going. Daniel studied her carefully. You asked what our greatest weapon is, Commander. It's not our technology. It's not our numbers. It's not even our strategy. He tapped his chest. It's this. The belief that no matter how bad things get, no matter how impossible the fight, we can still make it. That's what keeps us going. That's why we win. Zyra clenched her fists. For the first time, she realized something terrifying. The Corps were strong. They had weapons, they had warriors, but they had no hope. Their strength came from conquest, from taking what they wanted, from dominating those who were weaker. What would happen if the Corps ever lost? Would they stand back up? Or would they fall apart? She swallowed hard. So you believe hope is more powerful than strength? Daniel chuckled. I believe hope is strength. Zyra looked away, her mind racing. For the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if she wanted to fight anymore. Not because she was weak, but because for the first time she saw another way. A way she had never been allowed to consider. Without another word, she stood up. Daniel watched as she walked toward the door. She paused, just before leaving. Then, in a quiet voice, she asked, What would you do if you were in my place? Daniel leaned back, his expression thoughtful. I'd ask myself one question. Zyra turned slightly, listening. Daniel's voice was calm. Are you fighting because you believe in something, or because you're afraid of what happens if you stop? Zyra's heart pounded. For the first time, she didn't have an answer. And that terrified her more than any battle ever had. The warrior's choice. Commander Zyra stood on the bridge of her warship, staring at the massive Corps fleet that drifted in the darkness of space. Thousands of warships, each bristling with weapons, engines glowing like distant stars. They were preparing for the final strike. The total destruction of Earth. Her people had won the war. Humanity had surrendered. The Corps had crushed Earth's defenses, shattered its armies, and driven its leaders into hiding. And yet, Zyra could not give the order. Not yet, because she had listened, because she had learned. Are you fighting because you believe in something, or because you're afraid of what happens if you stop? Daniel's words echoed in her mind. She had spent her entire life believing in war. That was the Corps way. That was how the strong survived. But Daniel had shown her something else. Hope. A weapon more powerful than any warship. A fire that even total destruction could not extinguish. Zyra exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the metal railing of the bridge. If she gave the order, Earth would burn. But if she refused, she would become a traitor, a coward. She had never been afraid of battle before. But this was a different kind of war. A war inside her own soul. The final conversation. She turned sharply and walked toward the lower levels of the warship, toward the human. Daniel Reeves sat in his cell, staring at the ceiling. He had been ready to die the moment he was captured. But now he wasn't so sure. He could see the change in Exira. He had seen it in her eyes, in the hesitation in her voice. He had told her the truth about war, and it had shaken something deep inside her. When the doors slid open, he smirked. Back so soon. Zaira stepped inside, closing the door behind her. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then, finally, she asked the question that had been clawing at her mind. How do you do it? Daniel frowned. Do what? Zaira's jaw tightened. How do you live with war? How do you carry the memories of what you have done and not let it destroy you? Daniel exhaled, rubbing his face. You don't. Zaira narrowed her eyes. Explain. Daniel leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. You don't get rid of it. You don't forget it. You don't bury it. You carry it. And every day, you decide to keep moving forward. Zaira was silent. She had spent years leading armies, killing, conquering. She had never questioned it. Until now. She sat down across from him. If I give the order, she said slowly, earth burns. Daniel's expression darkened. But if I refuse, she continued, I become a traitor. My people will turn against me. Daniel watched her carefully. She was at the edge of something, a decision that would change everything. The warrior's choice. Zaira took a slow breath. What would you do? Daniel tilted his head. That's not the real question. Zaira frowned. Then what is? Daniel's gaze didn't waver. What do you want to be? Zaira stiffened. For her entire life, she had been told what she was. A warrior, a conqueror, a leader of the core dominion. But for the first time, she realized, she had never been asked what she wanted to be. The rebellion begins. Zaira stood on the bridge once more, staring at the fleet waiting for her command. Every second felt like an eternity. A single word would end humanity, or a single word would end her own life. The High Warlord's voice crackled through the comms. Commander Zaira, give the order. Begin the planetary bombardment. Zaira inhaled. She looked at the officers around her, her warriors, her people. Some of them would follow her no matter what. Some of them would kill her the moment they realized what she was about to do. Her hands trembled at her sides. This was it, the moment of choice. She thought of everything she had learned, everything Daniel had told her. The stories of human endurance, the battles they should have lost, but didn't. The fire that never went out. She understood now. Humans weren't strong because of their weapons. They were strong because they refused to give up. Because they fought for something more than conquest. Because they fought for each other. And now, Zaira had to make a choice. Would she be a warrior of the core, or would she fight for something greater? Her next words would decide the fate of two species. She clenched her fists. Then she took a slow breath, and she made her decision. The revolution begins. Daniel was still sitting in his cell when the alarms blared. Red lights flashed. Heavy footsteps pounded through the corridors. A voice echoed over the ship's comms. All hands, we have been betrayed. Commander Zaira has turned against the Dominion. Daniel blinked. Then he grinned. Guess she made her choice. The doors to his cell hissed open. Zaira stood there, weapon in hand, eyes burning with determination. She tossed him a sidearm. Come on, human, she said. If I'm going to fight for something, I'm going to need your help. Daniel chuckled, checking the weapon. Welcome to the right side of history, Commander. Zaira smirked. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. We still have an entire war to fight. Daniel grinned. Then let's get started. And with that, they ran. Toward battle. Toward rebellion. Toward a new future, together.